Hi, this is Paul McGuire. I want to talk to you today about a technology that's going to have profound influence on your life. It will either have a good influence on your life, but the potential dangers of a negative influence are that of a very high probability. I'm talking specifically about what is known as 5G technology. Now, most of you have probably heard of 5G technology, and some of you probably know the history of how we are arriving at 5G technology. So let me give you a short synopsis so you can understand both the opportunities and the negatives of 5G technology. When the internet and cellular devices began to take off in a big way, I'm talking about wireless laptops, wireless internet connections via your home computer, and then POW, what really caused an explosion in the technology of communications were cell phones. And on top of cell phones, we have just about every imaginable device in what an intelligence expert labeled the Internet of Things. So we're rapidly moving into a society where every technological device, and this intelligence expert talked about things like washing machines and microwaves and dishwashers and things that you wouldn't normally think of in terms of communications technology. But in our immediate future, and what is happening right now as we speak, is we are in the middle of a revolution, an evolution revolution of wireless technology. So in the early days, when not everybody had a cell phone and only a certain percentage of the public had wireless communications with their computer or laptop, many of you remember the nightmarish old days where you had to plug in a phone wire to get an internet connection. I remember because I was on the internet really early, and I'd plug this stupid phone wire from my computer into the phone jack, which acted as a carrier for the internet communication signal. And just loading a page could take 30 minutes. Never mind loading a picture. I mean, everything took enormous time, and it was so discouraged that many people just backed off from really using it. Now, you know what happened. They stopped using the telephone line as the primary instrument to carry communications information via your laptop, your computer on the internet, and then they went wireless. And thank God for that in many respects, and in many respects I wonder if we should thank God. But the point is that more and more people began to acquire computers. More and more people, I mean, many of you remember the time, I certainly do, where there were countless numbers of people who had no idea what the internet was. They had no idea what a home computer was. And I remember when I was on the internet in the very, very early days. Now, I wasn't on before Al Gore, the self-proclaimed inventor of the internet, but I was on in the early days of the internet. And I remember seeing the possibilities of the internet to communicate truth in an intelligent, understandable way. Specifically, the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And as I surfed the internet, and it was very primitive back then, there weren't like a whole lot of websites. My original website was in the early phases of the internet. And the person who inspired me to get on the internet was Chuck Missler. Many of you know Chuck Missler. I had the privilege of not only getting to know him, but working with him here in Southern California, because as the radio talk show host of the Paul McGuire Show, which was at that time the largest interactive Christian radio talk show in the nation. And Chuck would come into the studio of the station that I was with, the Crawford Broadcasting Station, and I'm always thankful to Mr. Donald Crawford, the president of Crawford Broadcasting, for giving me that opportunity. But I remember searching the internet, and there were very few people up there. I mean, Chuck Missler was like the only Christian that I can recall being on the internet. And then Art Bell, many of you remember, as a national, let's say, secular radio talk show host of Coast to Coast. And then, of course, George Norrie took over from Art Bell. But Art Bell also had one of the first websites. So there weren't that many people using the internet because it hadn't caught on to most Americans. It hadn't dawned upon them that their home computers could really open up a world of communications. And it took some time. It was a quick ramp up, but it still took a number of years. So what really kicked it in high gear is once they got rid of that stupid telephone wire, which you had to plug in the wall, and going on the internet back then, it was like riding a tricycle on a California superhighway when everybody's going at 80 miles an hour and you're riding a tricycle. That's how bad the early days of the internet was if you were using a phone wire. So when they moved to wireless, all of a sudden the wireless router enabled you to get some decent speed on the internet. And then they kept improving the microchip processors and other technologies. And today the average person doesn't have perfect speed on the internet, but they have at least, it's a livable speed. Now, what enabled them to do that? This is the technological part where I'm trying to focus in on. What enabled them to do that is in the early days, they were using, I'm not an engineer, obviously, or a communications specialist in terms of science, but they initially started out with things like 1G, which was not particularly powerful. So then they moved to 2G, which was a little bit more powerful, and then 3G, which was more powerful. And today, the majority of people like you and me, whether we realize it or not, are operating at 4G speeds on the internet. Now, 5G is imminent. 5G is being used in many cities across the world in a testing phase. It's being used in cities in the United States as a testing phase. But all the other increases in power, let's say from 2G to 3G, 3G to 4G, were modest increases in power. Now that we're going to move from 4G to 5G, we are going to realize 100 times more power. There is now 100 times more power in the communications transmissions between 4G technology and 5G technology. It's 100 times more powerful, which from a technological perspective, that's an enormous increase in power. And so it's such a powerful increase that there have been numerous scientists, technologists, people who are experts in the fields of communication that have been raising the alarm quite loudly about the potential dangers of a communications signal being used by kids on their laptops, kids on their cell phones. They're blowing the trumpet, if you will, about the horrific potential dangers of 5G, because you're moving into a communications power that's 100 times more powerful. Now, to give you an idea about how powerful this is, I'm going to share with you a military application. As most of you know, I do an enormous amount of research on a wide diversity of subjects, and that's the basis for my books. In fact, I have a brand new book coming out called The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World, which you can pre-order at a discount and get your autographed copy in advance at paulmcguire.us. And in that book, I talk about a lot of how these new technologies are going to radically impact our lives. And I focus in specifically on the potential dangers of 5G because the potentiality of danger is so high. Let me give you an example, and I go into greater detail in the book. I was watching a video produced by the U.S. military, and it showed either a military vehicle or a militarized police vehicle. And on this, let's say it's a militarized police vehicle, on this vehicle, there's this big rectangular square that's about a half a foot or 3/4 of a foot in depth. And I don't know, it's about 2 or 3 feet horizontally and vertically. Now, and again, it's about half a foot to 3/4 deep, and it rotates on command. So it's like this flat box that rotates on command. Now, this device is called a directed energy beam weapon. It's not science fiction, it's real. You can see pictures of them in operation. And this directed energy beam weapon that I watched is called a non-lethal directed energy beam weapon. In other words, its purpose is not to kill someone. Its purpose is really in terms of riot control or crowd control or the dispersing of an angry mob. So when the military vehicle aims this square at either an individual precisely or a group of individuals, or let's say a crowd, when that directed energy beam hits them, and the moment it's fired to the moment it hits them is like instantaneous. It's like the speed of light. And what happens is the people run for their lives. They not only disperse, they run with a berserkness, with an insanity, because what they're experiencing when this non-lethal energy beam weapon hits them, it's like their bodies are on fire. They feel like their bodies are burning up in flames. And so they don't have like some kind of cognitive rational map of how they're going to escape the beam. They go primal and they just run zigzagging like crazy, like a survival mechanism. They run zigzagging like crazy until they feel the burning stop and they know they're out of the focus and targeting range of the directed energy beam weapon. And it's very powerful and it's very efficient because the crowd cannot stand it, an individual cannot stand it, and he or she runs completely out of the area. I've seen pictures where the military aim the directed energy beam weapon at 2 or 3 guys in a small motorized boat. And when the beam hits them, they instantaneously jump out of the boat and swim in the water because it's like their bodies are being set on fire. But it's classified as non-lethal. And it's very effective. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to figure out that if you've designed a non-lethal directed energy beam weapon, that all you have to do is dial it up a little bit, and the non-lethal directed energy beam weapon suddenly becomes a deadly lethal directed energy beam weapon. And this is the case if the military wants to, in a real military battlefield, not using it against a civilian population for the purposes of non-lethal crowd control. But if the military, let's say, is in a hostile nation fighting enemy soldiers that are heavily armed, they can use this same directed energy beam weapon, but they can turn up the power enough to make it a lethal directed energy beam weapon. And when a lethal directed energy beam weapon hits you, you're dead. It literally fries your internal organs, and it separates your spine from your body, and in like a second or two, you're just dead. And it can kill groups of people, or it can have a narrow focus. Now, we have to remember this technology in its primitive state goes back many, many decades, because the former Soviet Union, now called Russia, was secretly using a directed energy beam device on a bunch of U.S. diplomats without them knowing it. And what they did is they set the range of this directed energy beam device. And what it did, as they aimed at the embassy with all the Americans in it, they had it set so that it would cause the Americans to get diseases like cancer and other diseases, but it was done at such a low rate that it took a fairly long time incrementally for them to be exposed to the constant flow of the energy beam. But over time, incrementally, a conspicuous number of people working in the American embassy began to catch fatal diseases and die from this stealth weapon. And there are many other applications to this stealth weapon technology, because really the root of it, as I explain in my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World, I go into the very roots of this technology. And it won't surprise you that it was Nikola Tesla, the genius, who discovered scalar technology and consequently directed energy beam weapons. So here's the problem. The level of frequency that the new 5G technology will use, remember, it's 100 times more powerful than 4G. So the level of frequency that 5G technology operates in is so powerful that it operates within the bandwidth or frequency range of non-lethal directed energy beam weapons. And if you go up a little bit higher, it operates in the proximity of lethal directed energy beam weapons. Now, I want to be very precise about what I'm saying. I am not saying that the 5G technology is beaming transmissions and internet and cell phone communications. I am not saying that the broadcast power that is being used is the same broadcast power of non-lethal directed energy beam weapons or lethal directed energy beam weapons. I want to make that very clear. I am not saying that. I'm saying that there is such an increase exponentially of the power of the frequency of 5G that, for lack of better terms, it puts the 5G technology potentially, depending upon how it's used, it puts the 5G technology potentially in the neighborhood or the outskirts of the neighborhood or the suburbs of the neighborhood of directed energy beam weapons. Again, I'm not saying that 5G is a directed energy beam weapon or a non-lethal directed energy beam weapon, but I am saying that the power of those frequencies puts it in the general, emphasis on the word general, the general proximity of that level of power. So, this is why it's a potential danger, because the way 5G technology is constructed to work is that it's unlike 4G and 3G. Because of 5G's unique technology, it emits pulses. So it doesn't necessarily require these tall, cell phone towers that are really, really tall that you see when you're driving on the highway or on a road or whatever. And then you have those strange, they look like rolls of aluminum foil without the box, painted white. And they're just strange looking antennas, and you've seen them many times. 5G technology does not require that antenna and broadcast antenna is mounted up on a very high pole. But what 5G technology does require is that you use shorter, let's just call them antenna sticks for lack of better words, shorter antennas, shorter broadcast towers, much shorter. But the problem is there are currently hundreds of thousands of cell phone towers in operation in the United States, and most of them are on giant tall towers. When 5G rolls out, you're going to move from hundreds of thousands of cell phone towers to millions and millions and millions of cell phone towers operating in 5G and at a much lower height. That means that you are going to see these potentially very dangerous 5G cell phone towers placed every couple of blocks in local neighborhoods, like your neighborhood. You're going to see them near schools. You're going to see them all over the place, because although 5G is 100 times more powerful, let's say, than the 4G you're using now, it requires millions and millions of more shorter 5G broadcast towers, but they have to be put every couple of blocks in a neighborhood or a school or by the local supermarket or whatever. So what you're going to see, and it will happen incrementally, but what you'll see is a huge, we're talking millions and millions and millions of these 5G towers, smaller, placed everywhere. Now, in the next edition of this Paul McGuire Prophetic Emergency Report, I'm going to talk to you about exactly what potential toxic, dangerous, and negative effect a powerful 5G transmission has on the human mind, your nervous system, your neurological system, your brain, your body, the development of your child's brain and body, its possible or potential link to things like ADD, ADHD, autism, and a whole spectrum of learning disorders, the potential effect on your nervous system, things like insomnia, and an entire spectrum of very serious negative health effects that we know are factual because there has been covered up test rollouts of 5G all around the world right now. You're just not hearing about it. And one final thing. Knowledge is power. There was a time in America that the advertising industry, Hollywood, and everybody else used the power of the media to program men and women into thinking that smoking cigarettes made them sexy, cool, hip, and built their self-esteem. You remember those. You can see it in the old movies. And then as they suppressed the truth, the tobacco industry suppressed the truth about the danger of cigarette smoking. But the truth emerged. And what happened when the truth emerged? Millions and millions and millions of Americans ended up dying horrible and agonizing deaths, their lives shortened because they had cancer that was directly the result of smoking cigarettes, but powerful commercial interests covered the truth up. We can't allow this to happen with 5G. You need to spread this message far and wide. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us.